there's all that much that British culture stands for, and I do think that that's a stable thing that Britain has had for years and years, and we need something.
Hello and welcome to Free Speech.
Your voice in the national conversation.
Hello, I'm Rick Edwards.
I'm Tina Dalila.
And these are the good people of Manchester. They are amped up, and rightly so.
Of course, this show is about you at home as well. Just use the hashtag BBC Free Speech to talk to us and, of course, to each other. Or, if we're running the power bar, a highly unscientific snapshot of what people on Twitter are saying, use the hashtags Free Speech Yes and Free Speech No.
OK, Tina's wanged on about online, so it must mean it's time for me to introduce the panel, which I will do. Journalist and filmmaker Mobeen Azhar. Conservative MP for Rainham and Gillingham, Rehman Chishti. Columnist for The Spectator and editor of Breitbart London, James Dellingpole. Journalist and broadcaster Nelafar Hedayat. And Labour Shadow Minister for Civil Society, Lisa Nandy. That is your panel. And tonight, our first question comes from the audience. Oliver Kingsley has a question. Where's Oliver? What do you want to ask, Oliver?
What is the main underlying problem that has caused the recent Islamic radicalisation in the UK?
OK, let's go to you, Raymond. What do you think is the underlying problem?
Well, look, I would say there is no one route into radicalisation at all. Different people come into radicalisations in different ways, whether they are on the margins of society, whether it's to do with religious, political ideology, or whether they want a sense of adventure. There is a number of different ways in which people end up in radicalisation. I think it's very sad state of affairs for our country when we have 500 British nationals, approximately, going along and fighting for this evil organisation called ISIS. It's not a state. It calls itself a state. It's an evil organisation. It calls itself a leader who calls himself a caliph. But if anybody knows about Islam, you know, to be a caliph, you have to be virtuous and pious. And this man's a former junior military officer under the former Iraqi dictator. He's not a caliph. So what we have to make clear that this organisation has nothing whatsoever to do with Islam, but there are a number of factors which pull these people there. One of them, I think, is important to look at, is we have clerics in this country. We had Abu Hamza, who was the one out there as a cheerleader. If you go on the BBC website, which I looked at, and Google some of what he had said, he said Muslims should kill kuffar, non-Muslims. It is completely incompatible with Islam. These pathetic individuals who it took us so long to get out of our country, he had no right to be in this country because he doesn't represent the true virtues and values of our country. They were cheerleading. And then also what you then have, the scope of the internet plays a huge role, which people get, incited to take up arms and take up these certain activities. So there's a number of different factors which we have to address. Whether people get radicalised in prison is another factor. So there is no one route, but I think what we have to do, working with the communities, the Muslim community, has to take ownership and leadership on this issue completely. I get it. I come from a Muslim background. My father was an imam. When we see individuals who purport to say this is in line with Islam, then we have to say this is not in the name of Islam. We have to say, these people are thugs, these are terrorists, and therefore they have nothing to do with Islam. So responsibility is huge on that.
Okay. Yeah, Judson here.
What has the government actually done to prevent the youngsters becoming extremists and go to Syria? Because we haven't heard anything from the government, neither doing anything.
Yeah, OK, we'll come back to that. Yeah, gentleman here.
Why is the mainstream Muslim voice that's against this not on TV enough and not in the media? You hear Anjem Chowdhury on Newsnight every other week. You rarely see imams saying against this or saying anything against Islamic State.
Yeah, I mean, this is mainstream TV. Yeah, lady here.
How are we expected, anybody in this country, to look at the media that we're getting negative stereotypes, or look at these people who are giving them negative stereotypes, if they are not given the truth? Religious education in schools is being constantly de-emphasised. If they're not being given the truth, how are they going to be able to recognise the lies?
Mobeen, back to the original question, the root causes.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I've interviewed extremists across the UK and in Pakistan and around the world, actually, and one common trait you always get is a degree of religious naivety. So let me give you an example of that. There was the case in Birmingham a little while ago. 2 guys went off to fight in Syria. They came back, were convicted. What are the last 2 books that they bought before they went off? They bought Islam for Dummies and Arabic for Dummies. Yeah, these guys are not religious scholars. They're hugely naive. And also the point, I think this guy here made the point about what is the government doing. You know, to be blunt, it's Theresa May and it's the Conservative government. They've actually slashed the budget for the Prevent strategy. So I don't think the government are doing enough. I don't think they're doing enough at all, actually.
So, you're shaking your head there. Why, Raymond?
Well, look, let me make it clear. The point that's just been made is that it's the Conservative government, it's the Theresa May who's responsible for it. But let's just be very clear on this. The issue of radicalisation and extremism has not happened in our country in the last 4 years. Extremism, radicalisation after 9/11 is an issue. After Afghanistan, radicalisation, extremism has been going on for year after year after year. To blame a government which has been in place for 4 years is completely wrong. The previous government... No, hang on, let me finish and you can come back with it. The previous government had to address it. They had to address it. They put forward the Prevent strategy. They looked at engaging through a counter-terrorist perspective with the Muslim community.
We also spent some money on it,
No, hang on a minute. No, Lisa, you can come on that.
Spent some money
Work was done on that. Work was done on that. But then also under this government, there's the Channel programme. Prevent and Channel. 1,000 individuals have been diverted away from going into extremism, violent extremism. But the point we need to make is not simply about violent extremism. It's about dealing with violent ideology or extremist ideology, which has to be at the forefront. And it's about working with communities' engagement, which I think needs to be done more, rather than simply looking at tough laws, intelligence. Intelligence, tough laws does not work by itself. You need to work with communities to address this.
So, Lisa, you're effectively representing the last government. Are this government getting it right?
Well, where I agree with Rehman is in what he just said about community programmes. But the trouble is that that's exactly what this government has cut. So they've introduced more and more tough laws and they've got rid of the community programmes. Now, this is a problem because if I was a teenager who was already incredibly disillusioned, the sort of young person that groups like this pick on and target, I would be so much more likely to listen to my mum or my brother or my dad or my friends, or even more importantly, to a young person who'd gone out to a country like Syria, who had been radicalised, who'd seen what it was really like, and who wanted to come back and talk to people like me about why it was the wrong thing to choose. And what this government is doing is it's closing off avenues for that. It's cut the funding to the community part of the Prevent strategy from 17 million to 3.5 million. And on top of that, I think we need to be really careful about not making this worse. I grew up in this city 20 years ago in Manchester at a time when there was huge resentment from ethnic minority communities about the way that the police would use the powers that they had, like stop and search, and disproportionately target some communities. You know, and if we don't have proper safeguards around this, what we do is we anger people and we isolate them at the very time that we should be reaching out to them. And I just say to Rehman, we have to be really, really careful about this, because actually we are saying that groups like ISIL are evil because they don't believe in democracy, because they don't believe in freedom, because they don't believe in tolerance and respect for diversity. But if we ditch those values in pursuit of taking on groups like ISIL, what do we have to say left to those young people who are so attracted by them?
But I think, Lisa, the point is this. You say, we have cut funding. You say that. But if you then look at the...
Have you cut funding?
Well, I think funding has been gone into different areas. It's gone into different areas. No, funding has gone into different areas. No. the reason I say that, no, let me answer it, and you can come back and answer me questions on that.
Yeah.
What happened under previous government on Prevent? They were giving money to organisations which had no credibility.
That's not
and
true.
No, hang on a minute. No, listen.
With a proven track record
well,
of working.
Well, they were
like the
giving
Street
to
Project in
organisations,
Brixton.
and therefore I would say simply throwing money at certain organisations to deal with it, did not resolve the problem. That's why we are here with these problems where they are.
Okay, yeah, maybe.
I've worked and I've interviewed members of a project called the Street Project in Brixton, which had an absolutely fantastic track record. They had all their funding cut by Theresa May. It's just fact. And one other thing, we can't have this debate without mentioning one thing. Every single radicalised individual and every single family member that I've ever interviewed has talked about foreign policy. Why is no one mentioning that? Yeah? We're pretending it's the elephant in the room, and we're pretending that we can't talk about it because it's a dirty word. Foreign policy. When our government hosts the biggest arms fair in the world every year at the Excel Centre, that's the problem. Yeah? When we say to people, democracy is a wonderful thing, but we're only going to export it to the countries that we like, yeah? Saudi Arabia, we don't bother with them because they support us. That's hypocrisy. And it's that kind of injustice that causes people to get upset and to get angry, and therefore they're vulnerable to radicalisation. It's not rocket science.
Let me bring in some viewpoints from people who are watching at home. These are the messages that are coming in. This one from Marshall. There should be no right of return for these savages, and if their families had prior knowledge or provided funds for them, then every single member of the family should be deported. Hang on, another one here from Paul. Keep them out of the UK. Why would you let them back in and waste millions of taxpayers' money putting them on trial? Is that a view you'd agree with?
No, I think that's completely ridiculous. I mean, these people... What are we saying? In effect, are we saying that these people are born in Britain, some of them, so if they're born in Britain, they're British citizens, are we saying it's not our problem, so we'll just leave them somewhere else?
It's dangerous.
If they've become radicalised, it's happened in Britain, it's happened here, they need rehabilitation.
James, you're
James.
Talk about why there is that anger and sense of division out there, which we've just seen in those tweets. I think one thing we haven't talked about is, I think a lot of this dates back to much earlier, to the 1970s, when the philosophy of multiculturalism was introduced. Multiculturalism sounds like a really nice thing. It sounds like a melting pot. Multiculturalism is a philosophy which is about division. It's about the exact opposite. It was designed to encourage different communities to retain their identities and not to integrate. I think if we're going to have cultural cohesion, which we need if we're not going to have some kind of civil war, we need to have communities getting back together again, rather than having this idea that it is good to have places in Bradford, places in Luton, which are, to all intents and purposes, Muslim ghettos. That is no way for people to get on.
In sort of research in this area, we came across Joy, actually. Joy, you have some understanding of why these young people are going across to Syria and fight with ISIS, don't you?
Well, I mean, as a Muslim myself, I can speak for any other Muslim. When they see atrocities happening all around the world, like my brother said here about foreign policy, when they see our brothers and our sisters on a daily basis getting killed, raped, humiliated in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, of course it holds dear to Muslims. The main notion being, for Muslims especially, we call our community a ummah. For Muslims, if you imagine the body as one ummah, if the finger feels a prick, the whole body will feel a prick. So these young brothers and sisters that are going out to Syria, they're getting disillusioned by what they're seeing, but it's not helped by British foreign policy. It's the fundamental root cause of it all. If you want to listen to these people really and get to the root of the matter, you have to listen to them, and it is foreign policy. There's no other justification of why would they leave their nice 4-bedroom council house and go live in a shack in Syria. Why would they do that? There must be something else, and it is foreign policy, I'm sorry to say.
And does anyone else know anyone who's gone out to fight? Lady here.
Coming from our own personal experience, we knew 2 girls that came to our high school, and we read somewhere that they actually went to Syria without their parents knowing. So coming back to that tweet that said even their families should be deported, I completely disagree with that. The basis of this whole country is like rehabilitate people, so why should they not be welcomed back into the country to find out the reasons as to why they were going? And from that, we can start to tackle the problem.
And so, did you know these girls?
Yeah, yeah.
And what were they like?
They're the type of girls that you don't expect to go out and fight. You know, the types that are like at the front of every drama production, the head of everything, so...
Interesting. Yeah, gentleman here.
Well, it'll be no surprise to anybody watching this that, again, Rehman Chishti is chatting absolute rubbish. You contradicted yourself. The first thing you said was over 500 people have gone out to fight in Syria and Iraq, and then you said, under this government, no one's been radicalised. And I knew it wouldn't be long, James, until somebody made a comment against Muslims. What do you mean by Muslim ghettos? The truth is, the legacy of this government, the legacy of this coalition will be demonisation. Demonisation of the poor, demonisation of Muslims, and you have overseen a constant... And it's people like you, Rehman Chishti, who are giving Muslims a bad name. You're the ones who are... people like you are giving Muslims a bad name.
So I'm giving Muslims...
Yeah. What it boils down to is very simple, and it goes back to the original question you were asking. This isn't a situation where foreign policy and what young people think are meeting. The whole point is, I feel like I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I've got a Tory person to the rest of me and a Labour person to the right. And it's the problem is foreign policy affects people emotionally. It affects their hearts, it affects their faith, and it affects who they are. And of course, what we do in foreign policy affects people emotionally. As such, the gap between what people feel and what politicians are telling them and what they're doing is so vast. No young person feels like anything they do, including vote, will make a difference. So why should they? They're decided to take it upon themselves to make a difference because they've got no other way.
James.
Can I just pick that gentleman up on what he said about Muslims being raped and killed in parts of the world? Actually, who's doing the raping and killing? Often in Syria, in Syria and Iraq,
was that
it's
put
often,
in place? Sorry, Bashar
al-Assad.
Who was Bashar al-Assad? His dad. Who was he put in? Who put his dad in place? Who made the psycho border? Who made the psycho that border between Syria and Iraq?
Do you agree that a lot of the killing is Sunni on Shia killing, so it's Muslim on Muslim?
That's a result of foreign policy. It isn't. That's a result of what's been happening.
Who put these stooges in place? Answer me that. Who put these stooges in place?
Raymond? This gentleman was taking issue with you.
I think the point was made earlier to say that, you know, I was accused of not getting the point, but the point I was making with you is when my colleague to my right here says that this problem is made by the Home Secretary. What I'm saying to you is, look, the issue of radicalisation and extremism hasn't happened over the last 4 years. It's been going on for a very long time.
We started bombing Afghanistan, really, hasn't it?
It's been going on over a very long time, and under successive governments, it has to be dealt with. And the first duty of the state, whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government, and God forbid a Lib Dem-led government, is to protect its citizens. That's your first duty. And I'm sorry, you may disagree with a foreign policy, but you have no reason to take up arms in another country.
How are you personally engaging young people?
Let me finish.
Hang on, Nellifer.
Let me finish. I think the idea is if you want to bring about change, you cannot use violence to do that. We have a system in our country. It's about democratic means. You elect members of parliament. Now, hang a minute. Look, hang a minute. You can't just shout at me from there. If you want to... Look, I'll hear you. You hear me. That's democracy. The fact is, you elect members of parliament to go there, you know, with the views. You ask them those questions that you have elected. Yeah, I know, but you're not in my constituency. You're not in my constituency.
He was elected. He was elected.
You're not in my constituency. I'm elected.
I'm not in your constituency, though. I can only talk
Well, if you don't believe in the democratic system, what can I say?
I didn't say I don't believe in the democratic system.
Okay, you two will have a tea later.
There's a big part of this debate that we're really missing, and we have to have this adult debate, and it's about this problem with labelling things like Muslim ghettos. Terms like that are really, really unhelpful. You know, I grew up in what most people would call a Muslim ghetto. I absolutely grew up in what most people call a Muslim ghetto, and you know, the people around me, they didn't start blowing themselves up. Terms like that are not helpful. And also, if we're going to have an adult debate within the Muslim community, we have to look at identity politics. We have to. I believe there's lots of evidence to support this, that there's a crisis of identity and there's a crisis of masculinity within the Muslim community. And what I mean by that, if you look at ISIS, if you look at how they market themselves, it's like a Hollywood blockbuster. They show these guys with their chests puffed out and like with guns, and it's all quite sexy. Yeah, we need to get away from that idea. These guys that are going to fight, they're not criminal masterminds.
But how do we get away from
They're
that?
not criminal masterminds. It's how we discuss the issue. These guys, more often than not, they're lost boys. They're lost boys, and we need to look at what has gone through their minds. And if we're going to have that honest debate, then we can't. I'm really sorry to just keep repeating this, but it's so important. We can't overlook foreign policy. We just can't do that.
On the subject of foreign policy, let's take a look at our power bar, which isn't scientific but gives us a snapshot of what people are thinking at home who are engaging with us on Twitter. The question we've been asking while you've been debating, is foreign policy to blame for radicalisation? 33% free speech, yes. 67% no. So the majority no. Nelifer, what's your response to that response online?
Well, you did say it's not scientific, so I'll take that with a pinch of salt.
But it gives us an idea.
But ultimately, I think this room has, in Manchester, has given a great response. I keep saying it again and again. But one thing that really is important to remember in this is it's assuming that everyone here, every Muslim here, on this panel and out here and in the country, is just one body, has one voice and speaks with one... There are so many different Muslim voices, so many different Muslim perspectives, mine and a million others here that contradict. And we're all expected to all of a sudden have like this spokesperson that speaks for all of us. No, they don't. And that's sometimes what's attractive to people when it comes to ISIS, because they're this unified, Rambo-ish style. They've got their ideas clear, they've got a leader, they know what they're doing. And here we are, we haven't got a voice. Someone else, where's the moderate voice in Islam? Doesn't exist. It's not sexy. No one wants to say those things because it just isn't attractive. So I can understand why people would think that, but in my heart, I know foreign policy affects what I think and believe and feel.
OK, what you were touching on there brings us on to our next question, actually, which is from Mohammed. Mohammed, what do you want to ask?
Well, we've already touched on it already. Is Islamophobia taken seriously enough?
OK, so is Islamophobia taken seriously enough? What do you think, Lisa?
I think it's a real problem in this country, actually, and I see it becoming an acceptable form of racism and discrimination at the moment, and I really, really worry about what we're doing about it and what sort of impact it's having on a lot of people in this country. And I think that sometimes we hear very angry voices who do exactly what you were just talking about. You know, they say that what do Muslims think, as if Muslims all think the same thing. And I think this is a very, very vocal minority of people. I don't think they speak for the majority of people in this country, but I think far too often they have a disproportionate voice. And I think we all have a responsibility to counter that. I think the media has already been mentioned by a number of people, and that's absolutely right to say it. But I'd also say this, that I know politicians aren't popular in this country at the moment, and I can completely understand why. But what I would say to you is that politicians have to be part of the answer to this. We're not going to get to a better place if you don't all make your voices heard and work with those politicians who are prepared to stand up against some of these things.
And what I would say to you,
but here I am,
you know, here I am I'm a 26-year-old young Muslim.
But here I am being drowned out by you, you know, and you say, oh, well, it's just Labour and it's just the Tories. But actually, there is a reason why we didn't launch airstrikes in Syria. And that is because the Labour Party, under Ed Miliband, decided that it is about time that we went and saw international consensus and played by the rules of the game on these things. Because, you know, you talked about foreign policy and lots of people in the audience
it's picking and choosing when it's convenient
sorry, let me finish.
I
listen to you. Let me finish. Because there is a reason why we're not at war in Syria, because it's about time we played by the rules of the game, because lots of people in this audience have said that foreign policy matters, and I think it does matter, actually. I think it matters. It's not a zero-sum game. There are lots of reasons why people are radicalised, but foreign policy does matter, and if we say to people, you abide by the rules of the game, this is a democratic structure internationally as well as nationally, and there are international rules, then we have to abide by them too. And politics does make a difference, because there is one reason that we didn't launch those airstrikes in Syria without consensus and agreement from the international community, and that is because politicians of my party stood up and said no.
Yeah, OK. Yeah, gentleman here.
I think it was a good question that you asked about Islamophobia, but I think an even better question would be, you know, is anti-Semitism or is Islamophobia or is racism as a whole not being taken seriously? I think we shouldn't, you know, narrow it down to one religion, but to a whole religion as a whole.
OK, yeah, there's a wider conversation. Yeah, gentleman here.
I disagree with Lisa and the far left, because if we look at over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, where the Syrian sort of civil war was over democracy and things like that, the UK and sort of the world in general didn't pay much attention to it. And it's not sort of either we airstrike or we do nothing. I mean, there is a ground in the middle where there is space for diplomacy, and we missed that opportunity, and we let it fester into sort of this cesspool of violence and just derelict streets where radicalisation was allowed to grow.
Yeah. Lady here.
Yeah, I think the media inflates ego and separatisation, and that makes us all forget that we're actually all one. So that's what makes our religion seem to be for.
Sure. Yeah, gentleman from here.
Well, I'd agree entirely with Mohammed and say Islamophobia is greatly to blame for radicalisation. But I think what we need to realise is where it came from. I mean, if you look at the last Labour government, even you were saying earlier when we bombed Afghanistan, when Tony Blair went over to Afghanistan, there was no terrorists hiding in civilian homes. They were normal people. And Tony Blair took the last Labour government and just bombed the crap out of them. And now they've come back and want revenge. And it's like you said the politicians under Ed Miliband haven't bombed Syria. But it's not because you didn't want to, it's because you realise that the public hate you for mucking it up last time. And if you were to do it again, it would increase.
I'm just trying to work out if I need to apologise for you saying crap or not. Yeah.
Thank you. Without doubt, ISIS should be condemned by all means. They are an evil organisation. So does the state of Israel, who killed 2,000 Palestinians recently. Why are you having double standards? Make no mistake that the Western intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, killing over 1 million people, is a direct result of this creation of this organisation. Now, once Martin Luther King said he has a dream, and Obama came in after a few years and he said he has a drones, all of those foreign policies of the West is creating this problem.
Right. Yeah, gentleman here.
I find it very ironic that we're missing a key factor here, and that's the media. You have the media coming out with these Islamophobic comments, such as Daily Mail, and the statements are absolutely absurd. But you take the word Islamophobia out and put the word Jewish there, and compare it to what Hitler would say under his fascist regime, and the comparison is just, it's very similar.
Is it similar, Raymond? Is it similar? Would you agree with what this gentleman is saying?
Well, I think in terms of the question of Islamophobia, look, I come from a Muslim background. My father was an imam. I came to this country when I was 6 years old. I came from a modest background. First in my family to go off to university to be a lawyer. I'd work hard to be a barrister. I'd make sacrifice to get there. But what I would say, in terms of dealing with the issue of Islamophobia, is this country, our country, one of the most tolerant countries in the world? I would say most certainly, clearly is. It gives you a chance, an opportunity. If you work hard, if you do the right thing, if you succeed, you can do it. But in our country, in our great country, is there a minority who want to divide us? Yes, there are. But does that mean there is a greater responsibility on the rest of us to unite ourselves? Yes, there is. But is there the issue of an Islamophobia? Let me come back onto that, if I may. Is when you see certain clerics, like Abu Qatada, Abu Hamza, who make evil comments to say that you should kill non-Muslims is completely contrary to Islam, then that feeds into that rhetoric by those individuals. The England First, the organisation which is running in elections, they go around and say there can't be a mosque in the Medway towns, even though the mosque has gone through a planning process. The local people are quite happy with it. But these people, these small organisations, want to divide us, whereas I would say the wider community, wider society here in the United Kingdom is one of the most tolerant societies in the world. Yes, there is an issue of Islamophobia, but there is a minority who push it. Yes, you shake your head. There's a minority who push it, but also then there is a responsibility on the wider Muslims to say when there are these individuals who make certain assertions which have nothing to do with Islam, to say that is not in my name, and therefore we have to work together to address that in all respects.
I think, that's all lovely, but my mum and dad. My mum and dad living in our Muslim ghetto, when my mum's making samosa, it's not her responsibility to say this is not in my name. She can do what she wants.
She should say it's not in her name. She should say it's not in her name.
Responsibility.
She should take responsibility.
Okay, everyone settle down. Let Mabin finish, please.
I'm making as well. It's absolutely not her responsibility. And also, I think the wider point as well that I think is really important is, the majority of people in Britain are really tolerant. The people that have more in common in this debate are the people in things like Britain First. They have much more in common with Islamic extremists.
Well, they're extremists.
They're extreme.
Yeah. And the thing that I was saying about lost boys, they're all lost boys. They're all looking for a cause. That's what they're doing. The majority of Britain doesn't care. The majority of Britain, you know, has Muslim neighbours. We all hang out together. Everything's cool. It's not a problem. But the problem comes when you get politicians using this issue as a political football and using phrases like Muslim ghetto. That's not
All right,
helpful.
on the subject of Muslim ghettos, this has come in from Nessa Ness, who says terms such as Muslim ghettos are part of the reason why people of ethnic backgrounds are over-policed, under-protected. This one has come in from Mark, who says, is there any wonder people have Islamophobia? Phobia is a fear. People just don't like Muslims generally.
Don't like
Yeah,
or
that's
don't
just
know?
rubbish.
Well,
That's
don't
rubbish.
like or don't know.
Rubbish. A phobia is an irrational fear. The fact is that most of the world's terrorist atrocities at the moment happen to be committed by people of a particular religion. You can get mealy-mouthed about it if you wish, but it nevertheless is a fact. So it's understandable that some people might be concerned about this. I've been listening this evening to people talking about how it's the fault of foreign policy, this abstract thing called foreign policy. It's the fault of this thing called ghettos. When you use a word like ghettos, that automatically radicalises people. Why are not even the moderate Muslims here speaking up, apart from you, sorry, my friend, why are you not speaking up on behalf of integration, of getting along, rather than this division?
But Nelify, you are, aren't you? That's your message.
Absolutely. First of all, Mubin, your mum making her lovely samosas in your ghetto should be the first person at the front of the queue representing the moderate Muslim voice. It is absolutely... Do you know why it's her responsibility? Just like why you're on the show right now, presenting your views, and everybody here is listening and being educated and understanding it.
Yeah, because I'm a certain kind of person. It's not my mum's responsibility.
Okay, let Nelify finish, please.
The reason it's her responsibility
is
because
it the responsibility of every Jewish person to condemn Israel? I don't think so.
If they think that they want to condemn Israel, there's nothing wrong and there's nothing worse if it doesn't happen than somebody not adding their voice, not having their say. That's the point of it all. There's nothing wrong with what... Listen, if you today went up and on the stage and represented every single Muslim voice in this country, you would have people would be up in arms about it. But if you and 15...
Surely you also think that there's a responsibility on the rest of us. I mean, I'm not Muslim.
Absolutely.
But when I hear James talking about things like Muslim ghettos, it does offend me, actually, because, you know, I live in Wigan, which is predominantly white British. If people started talking about white British ghettos, I'd be very offended, and so would my constituents. And I think it goes the other way too. And I think, you know, the point is that your mum has a responsibility to speak up. I think she does, but I think I also have a responsibility to speak up, and I'm not a Muslim. And I think my
But that's every voice added and every voice heard.
OK, there's a couple of points in the audience. Yes, lady here.
You keep asking why Muslims aren't condemning ISIS and radical Muslims, but the thing is, we keep forgetting that there are great Islamic scholars that have condemned them.
Yeah, you're right.
Imams in mosques have condemned them, but it's just that the media isn't giving them the representation that they deserve.
Gentleman here.
Right. Just the point he talks about integration. A lot of people forget that in the past World War I and World War II, there were actually Muslims from India and across the world that took part, helped British armies out. And also the other part as well, will the panel, if you're all panel with MPs, would you vote to go to military conflicts if your own son and daughters were part of the front line?
OK, we're going to wrap up that question and move on to the next one, which comes from the leaderboard. What have you got for me, Tina?
Yes, our next question comes from those submitted by you throughout the week on Facebook. After the questions were submitted, people voted by clicking like for the ones they most wanted to see on the show. We took the top 4 questions to make this the leaderboard, and here's how things stood before we came on air. This week, the top question is from Sheila Amadoda, who asks, why do nurses and other NHS workers have to strike to get a pay rise, but all MPs have to do is be an MP?
James. Why is it so easy for MPs to get a pay rise?
Well, it's very clear, isn't it? The starting salary of a nurse, I think, is 21,000. I think the basic salary of an MP is 67,000. And I think we all agree, we love our MPs, but they work really hard for their money, and nurses do nothing. So it's quite right that... But apart from being trivial, I think that we have to accept that the economy is struggling at the moment. I'm not sure that one of my concerns about MP salaries at the moment, actually, is that sometimes it might be an idea to actually pay them more, because maybe we would get I think we've got two good MPs here tonight, actually, but I think the calibre of some of the MPs I see in Westminster at the moment, I wonder whether we are attracting the brightest and the best.
So, do you think that about your fellow MPs, Raymond? Do you think that you'd get a better calibre if you paid them more?
Well, I would say you've got members of Parliament at the moment who come from all different backgrounds and all have their own different talents, and I think it's a matter for the public to judge how good they are. But what I would say on this, in terms of MPs' pay, I have not asked for an increase in pay.
Will you take it?
But no, let me make it clear. Let me make it clear. I think the answer to that is, at this point in time, I would not take it. I think I would not take it. No, okay. I would not. The reason
okay,
the
man said he's not going to take it. We all heard him.
Let me finish. I think the view's been very clear by the Prime Minister, by the Leader of the Opposition. When we ask for public sector to show restraint, and then to MPs in 1 year to be given 9% increase, it is completely and utterly unacceptable. So therefore, let me just make this point very clear. People say MPs want the pay increase. The reality is, the way things were done previously, where MPs were determining their own salary before I became an MP, was completely unacceptable. Some of the conduct by some MPs where they were imprisoned was rightly so. It was unacceptable. Under this new conduct, MPs do not determine their own salary. It is absolutely right and proper. So I want to make that point. This idea of 9% has come from an independent body, not members of Parliament. I don't want it. I think we, as members of Parliament, if we want people to have trust in Parliament, trust in politics, should show the same restraint as the wider public and the public sector.
OK. Nullifer.
It's a very simple point, and it's this. You are a public servant.
I said, I
You
agree.
are a public servant. And politicians nowadays need to remember that and need to be reminded of that. Whether they need a little card...
I said it.
Whether they need a card in their wallets to remind them that they're public servants, whatever it is, they need to be reminded of it. And it's
daily text message.
Well, a text message. Would you do it?
Text messages. The thing is that every day I am accountable to people that I represent, and whether I'm walking down the street in my constituency, sitting in the local pub, doing a surgery, doing a public meeting, answering the phone, dealing with emails, I am responding to and accountable to my constituents. And I guess what I would just say is there's no way on earth that Raymond and I are going to win on this, right? So whatever we say, So what I would just say is this. Firstly, I think we do need to pay MPs. And the reason that I say that is because I think we have far too many people in politics, actually, who are there because they've got a lot of money. And I think we need to make sure that we don't stop people from coming into politics because they can't afford it. And that's what we used to have before we paid MPs, when only wealthy landowners could be in Parliament. Secondly, I think we need to do much better about the way we set MPs' pay. So Raymond's right, MPs shouldn't vote on their own salaries. But actually, why don't we, instead of pegging MPs' pay to things like civil servants, why don't we peg it to average pay in this country? So that as people do better, we do better, but as people do worse, we do worse. And the last thing I would say, and then I will shut up because you can't win on this as a politician, but the last thing I would say is the question actually was about nurses and MPs, and we need a much bigger conversation in this country about pay, because we don't pay people what they're worth in this country, and we never have. And if we did, and we had a proper conversation about paying people what we're worth, I think we would pay stockbrokers a lot less, and we would pay care home workers a lot more than £6 a
lady here. Yeah. Don't look so surprised.
Well, coming back to the nurse question, nurses are extremely overworked and underpaid for the type of job that they do. And compared to MPs, you were saying that you answer phones, answer emails and things. Well, compare that to what nurses do. They save lives every single day. So why do they not get as much pay as an MP does?
James.
Just say that I get very nervous when I hear things like, it's time we talked about giving nurses more money. I think it's time that MPs recognise their sacred responsibility in that the government has no money of its own. It only has the money it takes from people in the form of taxes, compulsory levies.
Why are we cutting taxes for the richest 1% of this country? Why are we cutting taxes?
Can I just finish before you let your lefty point?
That's our money too.
Or by money printing, by stealing money from future generations. So the government has no money of its own. So when MPs start saying, oh yes, I think people should be paid more, just bear in mind it's not your bloody money,
No,
it's the
but
taxpayer
why are we
who's paying
cutting
this stuff.
taxes for the richest 1% in this country whilst asking people like nurses
Because
to care
maybe-
homework is not...
Okay, well, let's Raymond will answer this, I think.
Choices. It's
Raymond?
political
Well, I
choices
think
and
the
it's
point
not
is,
choices.
Lisa talks about this point actually, about money, but the reality is, it was her government which spent more, which borrowed more, which brought this country to its knees. I'm sorry, Lisa. No, you may not like it. You may not like it, but the reality, the reality is under your government, our country was broke. We had to make tough decisions to get this country back up and again.
Tina, what's going on online?
Some comments from people at home. The first message that's come in says, give the 9% to nurses since MPs don't want it. And this one from somebody who says, oh, I think we've disappeared, MPs from all different backgrounds. This is in response to your earlier comment. Really, aren't the majority elderly white men? But OK, you must...
Yeah, maybe.
I think that's a really crucial point because what no one has talked about is the culture in Parliament. You know, I think private schools and Oxbridge are hugely disproportionately represented, and that's a massive, massive problem. The thing is, I think it's too easy to just diss all MPs because MPs and nurses, in a way, they're quite similar because you could say they're, you know, at one point before you became careerists, I'm looking at you, you know, you wanted to make the world a better place. But, you know, I know a lot of teachers. My other half is a teacher. My sister's a head teacher. I know a lot of nurses. They're not careerists. The reason they're in their jobs is not because of the money. They're there because they want to, you know, clear up people's vomit.
Can I just make a point on that?
So because
hang on, Ray.
Let's just be. Can I just finish what I'm saying? You know, the 1% pay rise that the nurses were offered, in real terms, it's a pay cut. Yeah. They're voting to strike for the first time in, I think it's 30 years. Yeah, it's not. They're not doing this for fun. They're doing it because they're fighting for survival, and we, you know, as a community, as a public, we absolutely should support their strike.
Can I just make this point? It's where you have assertions which are made unfounded. I think it's quite sad. I get called a careerist. Let me just make this point very clear. I came from a background. I went to a failing high school which closed down when I left when I was 16. I was the first in my family to go to university. The salary of an imam is not very much, and therefore I had to work hard to be a barrister. When I went to be a barrister, it wasn't the commercial area which I went to do. It was legal aid and criminal, prosecuting people to make sure those who committed a crime get brought to justice, and those who actually didn't do something, to make sure that they get justice as well. And to say you have 8 years of life experience outside, from coming from a difficult background, and then to be accused by a filmmaker of being a careerist, I think it's utter nonsense. But what I do think is right, and you have got a point, is this, that there is an issue where the whole culture was over the years, public school, Oxbridge, coming in and doing it. That was wrong. It's got to change. We make changes in all parties, but more needs to be done to get more people from different backgrounds.
OK, we'll finish that debate on that. We've got another question from the leaderboard, I think,
We do.
Tina.
The second most liked question this week was from Maddie Howard, who says, since approximately 85,000 women are raped on average in England and Wales every year, when will we blame the perpetrators and help end sexual violence? That's from Maddie.
OK, so when will we blame the perpetrators? When will we stop victim blaming? Lisa?
Well, I think quite simply when we've got a culture change and when we face up to the fact that we have problems with attitudes across society, but most importantly, in positions of responsibility. So this year we've seen, for example, a 13-year-old girl who'd been groomed and then raped by a number of men in court being accused by a prosecution lawyer of being a predator. We've seen women repeatedly blamed for their allegedly sexual behaviour in situations like that. Girls in Rochdale, for example, blamed by the people who were supposed to protect them for making a lifestyle choice. And we see it over and over and over again. And actually, I think we need to do a couple of things. The first is that I think we need to accept that we've got a problem and we need to put much more money into supporting people to come forward, to make their voices heard and to get that support when they do. You know, what we've seen in the last few years is we've seen charities who help rape survivors being cut back. We've seen the schemes in courts that are supposed to help witnesses and protect them from that sort of aggressive questioning, stalling. But I think we also really need to take a long, hard look at the sort of leadership that we're showing in this country. You know, when you've got footballers like Ched Evans, who doesn't accept that he's committed a crime, walking back into a job where he is a highly paid role model in his community, and you don't have leadership from public figures, including politicians, saying this is absolutely wrong and something needs to change, that's when you create a vacuum, and these are the sort of attitudes that are allowed to flourish, and that's the end result.
And
I
I completely agree with everything you're saying there. And to add to that, you've got people like Dapper Laughs making it funny. It's funny to laugh at a woman getting raped. It's hilarious to think about either stabbing her or her having sex with you. And it's sometimes, as a British Muslim, I stand in the kind of, a lot of people who will understand that, I stand at a crossroads, and I think, you look at Muslim women in a hijab and you say oppressed, don't have a voice, can't do what you want, under a man's thumb, and then you kind of sometimes look at Western world and say, oh no, that woman has everything, she works, she does this, she does that. Well, actually, it's not as clear-cut as that. And in Britain, where we are today, in fact, a national survey found that a lot of police forces in our country are under-reporting some of the most serious crimes, including rape and sexual violence. It's easy to go over and say the other, that stigmatised, that other, you know, the hijabi, whatever, is the one who's oppressed. We're free. We've got it sorted. We haven't. And the first bit of solving this is actually having a police force, of having a government, of having policies that support the victim rather than perpetrators. That's the first step.
And I would say that one of the most important things around that is about what we do in schools. So we don't have sexual and relationships education in most schools at the moment. It's not compulsory on the curriculum.
It's got to
and there's
be.
a real problem, actually, because what we know is that a significant minority of boys at school don't understand concepts like consent. So we keep saying to girls, you need to protect yourself and you need to keep yourself safe. But actually, we're not looking at boys too, and we're not sitting with them with the
Just very quickly, it's all well and good to know what a fallopian tube is when you're in year 6 or year 9 or whatever, and most people here have done sexual education and sex education understand that. But consent, geez, the very basics of it, we don't understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah. James, so is this a cultural problem in this country?
I don't think that there is a so-called rape culture. I think it's a very emotive phrase. I think most men. I think most men know that no means no. I don't think that that we've become more of a rapey society. But I think one of the points you made, you referred, I think, to the grooming gangs in Rochdale and in Rotherham, and it's not just in the north. It's in Telford, in Norfolk. It's happened. We've got these organised gangs, mostly of Muslim origin. I think we need to. It's a fact.
It is also a fact that a majority.
Let me finish. Thank you very much. You outrageous interruption.
Okay, let him finish and then come back in.
I'm not spreading lies.
I'm just telling you what the member of that audience are actually. They are screaming at you.
Why don't you
that
read
girl
the
is
newspapers?
screaming at you.
If you look at the names
let him finish
that have come up in the court cases, you will find that most of them are of Kashmiri, Pakistani origin.
Nullifer.
And
no, that's Nullifer now, please.
You talk about rape culture. It's a very pretty state of affairs when the police and the social workers would not deal with this problem because they were too embarrassed about being called racist.
You're turning a question. You're turning a question about sexual violence into one about religion. First point. Second point.
Talking about massive.
Can I just finish? Second point. You and I know, James, that a majority of rapes and sexual violence perpetrated in this country is done by white Caucasian people. We know this. I want to finish. Do you know what? A lot of the time, as someone who works in the news, I get a bad rap, right, for kind of skewing opinions and going, oh, well, Muslims done it. And, you know, fair play to that. Sometimes that does happen in the media. But what's worse is when someone...
When somebody speaks the truth, you don't call
Do
them
you
a liar.
agree or disagree that the
Yes,
majority...
I totally agree with you.
So what are you saying?
Because the majority of the population is white. So, inevitably, statistically, you're going to get that problem.
OK, we'll move away from you two now, I think. Yes, gentleman here.
Does it really matter if they're black, white, orange, yellow? It's like,
At the end of the day, rape is rape and the subject will...
The point, gentleman at the back here.
I think James's attitude is symptomatic of the whole Islamophobia discussion. Because bringing religion into emotional matters unnecessarily does not help anyone. It only antagonises things. And I think that as far as the rape culture goes, there is a problem. It's, you know, it was in 1991 that marital rape was finally made illegal. That's not that long ago. I was 7 years old at that time. I think part of the problem is that too many people now just see rape as something which, the woman was asking for it. You know, women, as you were saying before, cannot win. They either are wearing Islamic dress and they're called oppressed, or they're slut-shamed. There is no happy medium, and the media are to blame for this division, whether it be on religion or gender.
Raymond.
Can I just go back to what that gentleman said over there? When I prosecuted cases and I dealt with cases, what I found is that you had people who committed rape were from all different backgrounds, because we have evil people in society for all different backgrounds. That is it. There are people from all different backgrounds who commit evil acts. And in terms of rape, horrific act, and therefore those who commit it have to be brought to account and made to pay the price through the legal system. The problem that we have in the legal system is this, if we're being very clear with one another here, is this. In relation to a stranger rape and a situation where you know someone, they're both horrific, they're both unacceptable. But if you put a case of a stranger rape before a jury, you'll have a situation where they'll look at DNA, they'll have evidence, they'll have CCTV, all the others. But when you look at people where they know each other and say 90 to 80% are issues of consent, and therefore in a trial is one person's word against the other. And therefore it's an issue where the jury then has to decide on one person's word against the other. Is it that one is less culpable than the other? Absolutely not. But in terms of evidence and how those cases are dealt with, there is that difference. And therefore what I would say, if we accept the legal system that we have with a jury, then what we have to do is to ensure, what the government is doing, is to ensure that the victim in this case gets all the support they can get from the beginning to the end. What I mean by that is, for example, a victim, when they give evidence, rather than coming to court and giving the evidence straight up in examination in chief, the ordeal, play that by recorded evidence.
But that's not available in most
it is.
courts.
Hang on, Lisa, if you let me finish.
It's not.
Lisa, if you let me finish.
Lisa,
if you let me finish. Lisa, if you let me finish. You know, you say this, but the reality is, under this government, we've just put the pilot projects out. It wasn't, she's right, it wasn't under a Labour government. We have, because what we have to do is to ensure that the court process is made fair for individuals from the beginning to the end, so that justice can take place.
Yeah, OK. Tina.
Yeah, lots of people are reacting to James's comments before. That generalisation is abhorrent. Ched Evans isn't Muslim. This from Bridget. There's no such thing as rape culture, says the man. Shocking. Maddie, who asked the question in the first place, says violence against women is an epidemic fuelled by the undercurrent of misogyny. And this one from Dr. CDF. We need to take a good, long, hard look at how sexist our society still is. The truth is, there'll be no freedom without
OK. Yeah, lady here, please.
There's a lot of cases that go undiscovered because women feel too scared to come forward because they feel that they may be judged because how they dress, how they look and how they behave. Maybe they may have drunk too much, or maybe they may not have been in the right frame of mind, but that should never, ever, ever be an excuse.
OK. Yeah, lady at the back here.
I know it's probably an unpopular view, but I completely agree that it is, in some areas, largely rape is committed by Muslims, because I grew up in Bradford, all right, and in that kind of environment, it is mainly Asian men, not because it's something about their culture, but because they're not getting caught. Like, I've had friends who've been raped, and the police have told them that because it's an Asian man that's done it, probably not going to catch them. But it happens all the time.
What has it to do with not catching them?
I don't know. Because they're not engaged.
Okay, no,
the police are too scared of being called racist to do anything. Like, it's
there's just such a divide between
So the
British
police are scared
population.
of being called racist, is your
Yes.
point?
Yeah.
Do you lend any credence to that idea,
I don't
maybe?
know what planet these police are living on. If are they actually saying to people, yeah, you know, I'm just going to put the phone down now because it's an Asian person, so
That's
don't
what they did.
report it.
That's what they did.
I don't think that they do that. You know, I think there needs to be an adult debate about these issues. Just going back to the original question and to some of the feedback as well, you know, there is a wider debate, and I mean this really seriously. I think in Britain, as a culture, we are scared of female sexuality. We really are. And so there's a massive debate to have around that. We need a culture shift, because this whole idea that if a woman is a bit tipsy or if she's wearing a short skirt, then, you know, maybe, you know, the song Blurred Lines, there are no blurred lines, actually. Like, no means no. And, you know, rape is completely unacceptable in any context. And I think that's what we should really be talking about. And women, you know, should not be afraid in any way to express their sexuality.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important.
I think we can all agree that rape is totally unacceptable. We're going to have a little bit of fun with the last question to lighten the mood. Where's Ben Sharma? Yes.
Does it matter that Ed is odd?
Great question. Lisa,
He's
we'll
not,
talk about Ed Miliband.
First of all, he's not odd, right?
OK.
But secondly,
He's a little bit
I'll
odd.
tell you what I would say, right? I'll tell you what I would say, right? That we're coming up to what I think is the most important general election in a generation. People often say that politicians and politics is all the same. Actually, you've got a clear choice at the next election about whether you think that the very wealthy people who have £2 million homes should pay more tax or not, whether you think that the NHS should be broken up and flogged off to private companies or not. You know, there are really big choices going on, whether you think youth unemployment should be a priority in this country or not.
So you're saying, no, Lisa?
The idea that it would come down to whether someone can eat a bacon sandwich in a photogenic way appalls me, quite frankly. I think all of us have a duty to get out there.
OK, Nellifer.
Ed Miliband is missing a trick here, right? Ed Miliband is genuinely missing a trick. If I was Ed Miliband's PR person, I'd be like, use it. Use your awkwardness. Use the fact that you find it really difficult to finish a sentence without going off on a tangent.
Yeah. Lisa, mention that. James.
Exactly.
There's a desperate craving right now for politicians who are authentic, who seem real. And some of them are interesting odd, like Boris Johnson, and some of them are fail odd. And I'm afraid Ed is fail.
Ed is fail odd. OK, Raymond?
Well, I would agree with Nilufer when she says, look, he's got to use his oddness. And I think that's right, because he's got nothing else going for him. Because when Lisa talks about, if I may say, youth unemployment, you know, under this government, in their own constituency, youth unemployment's gone down from 11% to 2% under this government. When she talked... Let me come back. I'll answer your point on zero contracts. Zero contracts were brought in by a previous government with
OK,
let me finish.
can't hear if the mic's not there.
Exclusive clauses under a previous government. We've actually made sure that that point is addressed, and therefore in Doncaster, Ed Miliband's own constituency, there are 0 hours contracts. Final point on that.
OK, thank you. No, we haven't got time. Mobeen, does it matter that Ed is odd?
After that party political broadcast, I'd say it doesn't matter that he's a bit odd, and anything is better than the Tory government, actually.
OK, Tina, finish us off with some online.
Ed is odd. Here we go. There's one here that says, Ed isn't odd, Cameron's odd. People who go to Eton are odd. They have no clue about real people.
That is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. That's also it from us with these TV debates. Come on, Tina. Tina's being blocked off by a man with some wires. Now she's running.
Yes, we are going online, so follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook for more debates, films, interviews, the whole shebang.
It's a brave new world, and I'm obliged to say I love it. From all of us here, good night.